everyone, this is a primer on how to write a conclusion for a history essay. Let's take a look. The conclusion is just the opposite of an introduction. While the introduction has you funnel in from a broad topic into the specific argument that you are making, with the conclusion, your job is then to funnel out of the essay, starting with a restatement of your argument or the thesis, and then taking out your readers to something a little bit broader, making a connection that you haven't done already in the essay. So funnel in with the intro, funnel out with the conclusion. What does that actually look like? The conclusion itself can be as short as 3 sentences and as long as maybe even 5 or 6 sentences. The first sentence of the paragraph is a thesis restatement. So take your argument that you expressed at the end of your introduction and put it into some new wording, but keep that restatement brief. After that, you are going to do what is called a synthesis. This is the component of the conclusion where you really have to think and make some new connection that you haven't already given in your essay and develop it just a little bit. So it can be as short as 2 really good sentences or even probably 3 or 4 sentences to really develop your idea fully. The synthesis is the most challenging and important part of the conclusion. What I have for you here is the language from the AP writing rubrics about the synthesis. The rubric says that the synthesis needs to extend the argument by explaining the connections between the argument and one of the following: a development in a different historical period, era, or geographical area, or a course theme or approach to history that is not the focus of the essay, such as political, economic, social, cultural, art, or intellectual history. Okay, so let's pick this apart. First of all, the rubric says that you only need to make a connection to one of the following. So there's a lot here and you don't need to do all of it. So what can this actually look like? First of all, you can make a connection to a different period of time. You can either connect back in time to an event that preceded the topic of your essay, or you can project forward in time to something that the topic of your essay led to. If you project forward in time, one thing to keep in mind is that you should not leap all the way to the world today. I should qualify, it is okay, it may be acceptable to make a connection to the contemporary era, but if you do so, it needs to be very, very specific. I have read so many essays where students have just said something like, the Renaissance is so important that we still see its art in museums today, which is a completely vacuous statement. So if you are projecting forward in time, the best thing is to still stay in history, somewhere in history, and make that connection. Or if you do see a really valid and interesting connection to the world in which we live, avoid the term today and make sure that you make that very specific connection. Secondly, you can make a connection to a different geographical area. So if your essay talks about one country in particular, you might draw a connection, maybe a comparison or a contrast with a different country in Europe or a different region of Europe or even a different place completely outside of Europe. That's another great way to go for the synthesis. The other direction or approach that you could take here is to stay in the same time and the same place, but connect to some other part of history or approach to history that was not the topic of the essay. And this is what the part B of this rubric is saying. So for example, if you were writing an essay about Renaissance art and how it had differed from medieval art, the focus of your essay would be art history, and maybe you would even tie in some cultural history. In the synthesis, then, you may want to discuss political history, specifically how the governments of Italian Renaissance city-states had developed new styles of government that differed from the medieval era. So that's an example of how your essay can have one approach to history in the body of the essay and in the thesis, and then you funnel out of the conclusion by connecting to some other type of history at that point in time. So an important thing to keep in mind here is the synthesis is not a summary of your essay. The only part of the conclusion that summarizes what you already said in the essay is the thesis restatement. Beyond that, you are making a connection. That word connection is really important here, and it needs to be a new connection. So nothing that you have already said in the introduction or the body paragraphs. Okay, let's take a look at some examples. The first example that I'm going to show you is not a historical one, but after that we'll take a look at 3 more examples that are historical. Why is St. Francis better than Bellarmine? Pause this video and read the conclusion. So this conclusion is not a historical one, or rather this essay is not a historical one. So the criteria that I gave you for deciding what kind of conclusion you might do don't apply quite as well here. We may loosely apply the one about geographical area because the essay focused on two schools, St. Francis and Bellarmine, and as a means of funneling out of the essay, this synthesis draws in MIDI and presentation. Here is a historical example. Analyze the consequences of the Black Death. Pause this video and read the paragraph. So this conclusion takes the approach of connecting to a different time period, and in this case, it connects to time after the event in question. So the topic of the essay is the Black Death, and this synthesis statement projects forward in time and says what happened with the plague over the course of time. It does leap up all the way to today when it says that the plague continues to infect rodent and human populations occasionally, but this is an acceptable connection to the contemporary era because what it says about it is very, very specific. Here's another conclusion for the same essay question, just to show you that there are many different routes that a synthesis can take. Pause the video and read the paragraph. So this synthesis takes the approach of connecting to other events in the same time and same place. In this case, that is the events of the 14th century. Now, one thing to keep in mind here is that it is possible that the content of the synthesis that we see here could also be a good introduction for this essay. If that is the case, you can only use this information in either the introduction or in the conclusion because we don't want to see repeating information here. If the introduction to the essay took a different approach into the topic of the Black Death, then this would be a very appropriate synthesis to connect the Black Death to other things that were happening at the same time. Here's our last example. The essay question is compare and contrast the ideas of Machiavelli and Mirandola on the nature of man. Pause the video and read the paragraph. This paragraph takes the approach of connecting to events in a different geographical area. The topic of the question, Machiavelli and Mirandola, pertains to the Italian Renaissance. So it seemed like a logical leap then to say, if we're talking about these Italian humanists, what is going on in another part of Europe? Northern Europe also experienced the Renaissance, and they had their own somewhat unique branch of humanism called Christian humanism. So that was a logical conclusion to draw.